Okay, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ethics Seminar Series. This is John. I'll be moderating the seminar with Kathy Medney, our communication manager, and our director, Naz Peter, also joined us, and he will be introducing the speaker. Just so you know that this seminar is being recorded, and we will publish the recording on our YouTube channel. And after the speaker's presentation, we encourage you to speak to the speaker about any questions you might have. And before the speaker gets started, I'm going to hand this over to our director, Naz Peter. So Naz, please proceed.
Thanks very much, John. Hello and welcome everybody to this ESSEC seminar. And it is my pleasure to welcome Brian Soden, today's seminar speaker. Brian is a professor of atmospheric science at the Rosenstiel School in the University of Miami, and is a well-recognized international experts in climate issues, specifically on radiative forcing and the cloud aerosol interaction. Brian received his bachelor's degrees from the University of Miami and later on his master's and PhD degrees from the University of Chicago. Before coming back to Miami, he took a detour via Princeton and worked as a visiting scientist and lecturer there, and as a physical scientist with GFDL. He has worked, I think, most of his career actually on satellite observations and on using satellite observations to improve what we do in terms of climate studies and the radiative forcing and radiative effects. Brian is a fellow of AMS and ADU, and he served as a lead author on the IPCC assessment reports in 2007 and 2013. So with that kind of background, we look forward to what you can tell us today, Brian. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you, John, for the opportunity to speak to everyone today and share you some of the work that we've been doing here at GFDL, or at Miami, with collaborators at GFDL. Let me share my screen here, put it in full screen. So, and by we, there's a number of collaborators we've been working with here. Most of this work that I'm showing has been done by Chan-Yun Park. This picture of him down on the left. He's a PhD student here at the University of Miami, but in collaboration with Ryan Kramer and Hao Ji-hee, who are both former students of mine, and then another collaborator and good friend, Tristan LeCouillier at the University of Wisconsin. So the subject today is on aerosols, clouds, and recent trends in Earth's energy imbalance. And just as a quick primer on aerosol-cloud interactions, there's a couple ways that aerosols affect the flow of energy into and out of the climate system. Of course, clouds reflect sunlight back to space, but aerosols are also scatterers, and they reflect sunlight back to space. So that's referred to as the aerosol direct effect, the scattering effect of aerosols. And that obviously has a cooling effect. But kind of the more complicated role is that aerosols also interact with clouds, and they do so really through changing the number of droplets within a cloud. So aerosols, certain types of aerosols also act as cloud condensation nuclei. And so when you increase the number of aerosols, that increases the number of condensation nuclei, and that produces an increase in the number of cloud droplets, but also reduces the size of the cloud droplets. And so if you keep the liquid water content of the cloud the same and you increase the number of cloud droplets and reduce the size, that makes them brighter. That's referred to as the Toomey effect, the increase in cloud albedo. But there's also another way that increase in cloud droplet number tends to suppress drizzle and precipitation. And so that tends to lengthen the lifetime of a cloud just by reducing the sink of moisture out of the cloud. And that's referred to sometimes as the Albrecht effect, named after Bruce Albrecht. So these are the two main indirect effects that aerosols can have on clouds. There's other kind of more complicated and less well understood aerosol cloud interactions, but these are kind of the dominant two within the literature, and these are the ones I'm going to focus on today. And so why are we interested in aerosol cloud interactions? Well, one reason is that the rate of forcing from aerosol cloud interactions is the largest source of uncertainty in our estimates of historical radiative forcing. And this uncertainty in aerosol cloud interaction, the rate of forcing from that interaction, limits our ability to constrain estimates of what climate sensitivity is, and therefore also limits our ability to make projections of future climate change. And more to the topic of today's talk is that satellite observations and model simulations suggest that while aerosols have had a cooling effect over most of the historical period, that there's been a reduction in anthropogenic aerosols in the last couple of decades. And so that cooling effect from aerosols perhaps has declined over the last couple of decades. And so kind of a warming trend, if you think of it that way. And the real question we want to ask, or we're trying to ask and answer in this work, is to understand to what extent the decline in anthropogenic aerosols has contributed to the observed change in Earth's energy imbalance. So what is the Earth's energy imbalance? It refers to the fact that there's an imbalance between the amount of energy coming into the climate and the amount of energy going out. Specifically, there's more energy going into the climate system than leaving the climate system at the top of the atmosphere. And this is a graph of series measurements that show this imbalance. So back in the early 2000s, there was about between 1/4 and 1/2 of a watt more energy coming in than leaving. But over the last 5 years or so, that imbalance has increased from about 1/2 a watt to almost 1.5 watts. So this rate of surplus energy entering the climate system has basically tripled over the last 20 years. So that's been obviously a source of great concern. And trying to understand exactly there's been a lot of work trying to understand exactly what's behind this growing surplus of energy entering the climate system. Now we can take those series satellite measurements and separate them into the contributions from changes in solar radiation and contributions from changing outgoing long wave radiation. And most of this trend, so this graph shows this decomposition into shortwave in red, long wave in blue, and then total or net radiation in black. And most of the increase in this net radiation is driven by an increase in the amount of short-wave radiation or solar radiation that's being absorbed over this period. So that's one hint as to what's going on here. It's being driven by an increase in the amount of solar radiation. We can then use something called radiative kernels to take that increase in solar radiation, which is going to be the subject of the rest of this talk. We're really going to focus on what's driving that increasing trend in absorbed solar radiation. We can use this approach called radiative kernels and separate the role of different quantities in contributing to that increase in solar radiation. And that's what's shown here in red. So the black graph shows the trend over the last 25 years or so in net radiation. The blue is the sort of that decrease in outgoing long-wave radiation. The red shows the increasing trend in solar radiation. And then these light red bars show if you take that total trend in short-wave radiation and attribute it to different quantities, these are their relative contributions. And so not surprisingly, most of this trend is being driven by an increase in or I should rather say a reduction in low cloud cover or low cloud reflectance. So it's really the trends in cloud cover, low cloud cover specifically, that's given rise to this increased trend in solar radiation. And that's this first graph here on the left, first bar on the left. There's a non-trivial contribution from changes in sea ice and snow cover. So maybe about a quarter of this trend is being driven by changes in sea ice and snow cover. And the other 3/4 primarily coming from changes in clouds, water vapor, the direct radiative effect of aerosols, and then other quantities are all quite small. So we're really, in this talk, we're really going to try to focus on what's driving this increase in absorbed solar radiation due to reduced reflection in low cloud cover. One thing we do know from model simulations is we can look at climate model simulations over the same period and ask what is, or even just over control integrations driven only by internal variability. And we can ask, what is the likelihood that you can get that kind of observed trend in net radiation or solar radiation from internal variability alone? And the answer is very small. Only something like 1 out of 100 of these simulations can reproduce a trend of comparable magnitude to what we see in the series observations. So what we're really looking at here is, a high likelihood that this is being driven by external forcing, not from internal variability. This observed trend over the last 20, 25 years really lies outside the range of internal variability, at least as simulated by current climate models. We can also, there's been some recent studies to try to understand which of these external forcings are responsible for this trend in the Earth's energy imbalance. And this shows a recent paper that came out last year by Soden et al. And the top curve shows climate model simulations of the trend in the Earth's energy imbalance if they include all anthropogenic forcings over this period. So they're including both changes in greenhouse gases as well as changes in aerosols. And the black line shows the observed trend, and then these different colored lines show trends from different models. And so you can see that when you include all forcings, the models are capable of kind of getting to within the uncertainty range of the observations in terms of reproducing that trend. And then this same group went back and took those same climate models and included all forcings, but they kept the anthropogenic aerosol forcing fixed at 2000 values. So the difference between the top graph and the bottom graph is that there's no changes in aerosols, anthropogenic aerosols over this period. And here you can see that there's the trends are much smaller.
Yeah, Brian, I'm not sure if I think maybe his Zoom crashed. I thought that was just me, actually. Yeah, he left, so I think he's gonna rejoin. Okay.
Oh, it's always hesitant to say something with that. It's like,
Okay, I just unmuted.
Okay, we can hear you again.
Everything's good? Okay.
Yeah, everything's good. We just need your screen. We need your slides
Yeah,
back.
let me go back. Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, so model suggests that there's a significant contribution from the anthropogenic aerosols, roughly about half, and we want to come at this from an observational approach. So the data we're going to use here, obviously we're going to use the series measurements of the shortwave cloud radiative effect. So I'm going to refer to that as CRE underscore low cloud. So we're going to specifically consider a shortwave cloud radiative effect for low clouds, because that's where we see the biggest contribution to the trend in increasing absorbed solar radiation. We're also going to take data from MODIS on aerosol concentration, cloud droplet number, and cloud liquid water path. We're going to use MERA2 for estimates of sulfate concentration, and also for looking at different weather variables that I'll talk about in a second. And then we're going to be using monthly anomalies of all these quantities over the period from 2003 to 2023. So that's the observational data we're going to use. And just to start out, there is, especially in the MODIS measurements, pretty clear signatures of declining aerosol emissions in observations of, say, aerosol optical depth, which you see in the middle panel. So this is from a paper by Johannes Voss et al. And so these kind of green regions indicate areas where there's been a decline in MODIS aerosol optical depth. And you can see there's a lot of decline over, North America, Western Europe, Eastern Asia. And those are also consistent. On the left shows the trends in SO2 emissions from MERA2. So you can see those are pretty consistent. And then on the right shows the trends in cloud droplet number concentration. And so you see in the same areas we're seeing declines in anthropogenic aerosols, we're also seeing declines in cloud droplet number, right? And that's consistent with these kind of very simple aerosol cloud Toomey effects and Albrecht effects. So the point I'm just making this is that you can see clear signatures of this decline in anthropogenic aerosols, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. And there's been a number of studies that have tried to constrain aerosol-cloud interactions from observations. And this is a kind of a review paper that came out several years ago by a number of authors. And here's just a list of other studies that have tried to do this. And the real challenge in these studies is that clouds are complicated. And so there's lots of other variables that affect clouds besides aerosols, right? And so how do you control for all these other weather influences on cloud cover, cloud optical properties, cloud water content, and so forth? And there's been a number of different approaches used to try to control for that effect. One of the approaches I really like, and one that came out a couple of years ago in a paper by Casey Wall, is called cloud controlling factor analysis. And what this study did is use this cloud controlling factor analysis to try to assess the aerosol cloud interactions. And so I'll go into more detail about the cloud controlling factor analysis in a second, but the whole idea here is to try to control for these other weather influences on cloud properties, so you can isolate just the partial changes in cloud properties that are due to aerosols separate from all these other influences. And so if you're not familiar with cloud controlling factor analysis, essentially what it is multilinear regression. So, and there's a paper that kind of first introduced this, Scott et al., that came out back in 2020. And the idea here is to use multilinear regression to compute the partial sensitivities of the cloud derivative effect of low clouds to different known cloud controlling factors. These are quantities that are known to have an influence on low cloud properties. And these include things like surface temperature, EIS's estimated inversion strength, surface temperature advection, boundary layer relative humidity, vertical velocity, and so forth. And then to include, in addition to these kind of weather influences, to also include information about aerosol concentration as another cloud controlling factor. So this was kind of the novel thing that Casey Wall introduced in their PNAS paper. And so just to kind of visualize how this works, here's an example. If we look at just this region off the east coast of Asia and the northern Pacific, and here's a time series in black shows the monthly anomalies and the cloud radiative effect of low clouds. The red line here in the top graph shows the multilinear regression fit to that using this cloud controlling factor analysis. So you can see it does a pretty good job of capturing this monthly scale variability. And then the multilinear regression what it enables you to do is to decompose the contributions from all those different cloud controlling factors. And that's what all these different lines in the middle panel are showing. So these are, the individual contributions from all these different terms. And really what we're interested in here is just the aerosol trend. So that's the blue line here. This is the contribution of aerosols to these anomalies in cloud radiative effect of low clouds. And so you can see that there's lots of other influences on here besides aerosols. And so this, how you really control for these other terms is critical in trying to estimate these sensitivities of how aerosols are changing cloud optical properties. And so if you, just to go back, if you do this regression, isolate the contribution of aerosols to the changes in the cloud radiative effect from low clouds at every grid box over this period using monthly anomalies, and you just plot the slope of that line, that's what this graph shows. This is the susceptibility. This is referred to the susceptibility. This is how the cloud radiative effect of low cloud changes with a logarithmic change in sulfate concentration. And this is from, Casey Wall's approach here. And so you see most of these numbers here are negative, indicating that an increase in sulfate leads to a stronger cooling effect of clouds in terms of how much solar radiation is being absorbed. So if you take this susceptibility and you multiply it by the change in aerosol concentration over the historical period, you can get an estimate of what the effective radiative forcing is based upon this observed sensitivity. And this is what Casey Wall published in their PNAS paper. So you can see that there's been this strong cooling effect in the Northern Hemisphere over the historical period due to aerosol cloud interactions based on this observed estimate of the susceptibility. Now, what we want to do here is to take the approach that Casey Wall developed and modify it a little bit to include explicit recognition of aerosol activation rates. And why do we want to include aerosol activation rates explicitly in this analysis? One reason is because previous work, and this is from a paper by Edward Griesby et al., showed that requiring changes in cloud properties to be mediated by a change in cloud droplet number significantly reduces the meteorological covariance. That's this big, kind of elephant in the living room that we're trying to get around here. How do you control for all this meteorological influence on clouds and really isolate the aerosol contribution? Well, they showed that explicitly requiring changes in cloud optical properties due to a change in aerosols to be mediated through a change in cloud droplet number greatly reduced the meteorological covariance. And more importantly, it also greatly reduced the sensitivity of the aerosol optical depth versus cloud fraction relationships. And that's, you can see by comparing the panel on the left, which shows the susceptibility of cloud fraction to a change in aerosol optical depth without requiring this cloud droplet mediation, to one on the right, where you do require any changes in cloud fraction to be mediated by a change in cloud droplet number. And the difference between these two is about 80%. So imposing this requirement that changes in cloud properties be mediated by a change in cloud droplet number, which is what we refer to as the activation rate, makes a really important difference. And so you can do this same process. You can estimate aerosol activation rates using the cloud controlling factor analysis as well, and produce a map of what the aerosol activation rate looks like through that same approach. And that's what's shown here. So this is the change in cloud droplet number, which we get from MODIS due to a change in sulfate concentration. And you can see that there's, while everything is largely positive, there's very large spatial variations in it, right? And so these are important to account for. There's not just sort of a uniform activation rate everywhere. There's large spatial variations in the activation rate. And so it's important to be able to account for these differences in activation. And so what we do in terms of our modified cloud controlling factor analysis is we define a new estimate of susceptibility, where we require any changes in aerosol concentration to be mediated through a change in cloud droplet number, which we get from MODIS, and then multiply that by the sensitivity of the changes in cloud radiative effect due to a change in cloud droplet number. So this is our new estimate of susceptibility that explicitly requires cloud droplet number mediation. And you can do the same thing that Casey Walls did, multiply that by the change in sulfate concentration, and you get another estimate of the effective radiative forcing from aerosols over the historical period. And you may notice that the colors here are much lighter than they were in the previous version where you didn't require activation rate. And we can compare these here. And so explicitly requiring activation significantly reduces the susceptibility of clouds to changes in aerosols. And that leads to a significantly smaller estimate of the effective radiative forcing due to aerosols. And so we have two different estimates, and these differ by at least a factor of 2. So without activation, and so these differ by about a factor of 2. If you don't trust the Merritt-2 reanalyses, we can do the same thing using MODIS aerosol index as a proxy for aerosol concentration, and you see the same kind of differences here. So this difference in susceptibility we see doesn't depend on whether you use MERA-2 to define aerosol concentrations or whether you use MODIS aerosol index to define aerosol concentrations. It really has to do with whether or not you explicitly account for aerosol activation or not in your estimate of low cloud susceptibility. So we have these two different estimates. Without activation, which is the original way Casey Walls presented it, you get something that's, I guess, actually closer to a factor of 3 larger than if you require activation. And obviously, we'd like to know which one of these two approaches is more accurate. And so to do that, we do something called the perfect model cross-validation. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to apply the same cloud controlling factor analysis to climate model output. And so instead of doing it to observations, we can use the same quantities like low cloud radiative effect, all the different meteorological quantities. We can take those from a climate model output and estimate, based upon that, what the effective radiative forcing from aerosol cloud interactions is, either doing it without activation, as Casey Walls originally proposed, or with activation rate. So we'll have two different estimates, and then we can compare that to what we'll refer to as the true effective radiative forcing from those models. And we get the true effective radiative forcing by looking at specialized historical experiments where there's only aerosol forcing imposed. And so there's no other external forcing there. We know the only thing driving the changes in clouds is due to aerosols. And so we refer to that as the true effective radiative forcing from aerosol cloud interactions for that particular model. So we have two different estimates, one with activation, one without activation, and we can compare each of those estimates with the true value from these single forcing experiments. So this shows on the x-axis is the true estimate of the effective radiative forcing. Each one of these circles represents a different model. And the y-axis represents the estimate without activation rate. And you can see that, the agreement here actually isn't all that great. The correlation is only 0.6, and the RMS and bias are rather large. If we repeat that, but we do the analysis with activation rate, we see we get a much better agreement. The correlation increases, the RMS decreases, the bias decreases by both about 40%. So in this perfect model test, including activation rate makes a big difference, and it reduces the errors by about 40%. So what we take from that is that the cloud controlling factor analysis with activation rate gives us a much better estimate of what the effective radiative forcing is when we're trying to do it from observations. And just to kind of compare these two different estimates with sort of community estimates of what the effective radiative forcing from aerosol cloud interactions has been over the historical period. This is a bar graph kind of showing the median value in black, and then the range of uncertainty. The top is from the most recent IPCC report. The second one is from WRCP report that came out in 2020. The estimates without activation are shown in the dashed lines here in white, and with activation are shown in red. So there's this kind of factor of 3 difference. Again, it doesn't matter whether you use aerosol index from MODIS or you use sulfate concentrations from MERA2, you get much lower and much smaller uncertainties when we include activation rate. But these estimates tend to lie on the very low end of the community assessment. So actually not that far away from what the WCRP best estimate was, but much smaller than what the IPCC best estimate was. All right, so now we have a way of estimating aerosol cloud interactions from observations, and we're going to do it using a cloud controlling factor analysis with activation rate, because that gives much better agreement with the perfect model cross-validation. So the first part in trying to estimate how aerosol cloud interactions have contributed to the recent trends in Earth's energy imbalance is we need to look at well, just to remind you, if we go back to this graph, we're really interested in how, understanding this trend in cloud radiative effect over the last 20 years. And we can kind of rule out variability. Model estimates say this trend is way too large to be reduced by internal variability. So that kind of leaves either cloud feedback or cloud aerosol interactions. And so now we're going to try to estimate the contribution of aerosol cloud interactions to this trend. And to do that, we need to start out just by looking at the trends in aerosol concentration. So this shows on top the MODIS trend in aerosol index over the period 2003 to 2023. And in the bottom shows the trend in sulfate concentrations at 925 hectopascals over the same period. And you can see, as we kind of pointed out in the beginning, that there is this decline in aerosols over downwind from Southeast Asia, downwind from North America. So you do see this Northern Hemisphere decline in aerosols, which is consistent with reduced sulfate emissions. And you see that also in the MERA2 reanalyses. But what's interesting is that there's this very large increase in aerosols over the Southern Hemisphere, right? And that shows up both in the aerosol index and in the MERA2 sulfate trends. And if you look at, this is now a vertical cross-section of the time series. So you have height versus time, and these are just the anomalies in sulfate concentration from MERA2. And you see over Southeast Asia and North America, there's been kind of this steady decline. Over the Southeastern Pacific, what you see is that there was kind of a decline going up to about 2016 or 2017, and then there's these very large kind of sporadic pulses of increased aerosols in this region. And these are being generated. There's been a series of fires in the Southern Hemisphere over Australia and in South America. And a number of these fires, as well as the Unga eruption in 2022, these have all contributed to this increase in Southern Hemisphere aerosols over this period. So now if we try to estimate the aerosol cloud interaction over this period, we take the trends in aerosols, either from MODIS or from MIRA 2, and we multiply it by the susceptibility that we showed previously, where we're explicitly including aerosol-cloud interactions. And when we do that, we'll see that, so we're taking the trend in sulfate concentration times our susceptibility with explicit inclusion of activation rate. And whether we use MERA2 sulfate or whether we use MODIS2 aerosol index, we get almost zero net effect of the trend in aerosols on the trend in Earth's energy imbalance. So the trend in aerosol-cloud interactions, the global average of these turns out to be identical. That's just spurious, but the point is that they're very small, right? Less than 1/10 of a watt per decade. And the main reason for this is just that there's been this compensation. There has been a decline in anthropogenic aerosols over the northern hemisphere, but this increase in natural aerosols from forest fires and from the volcanic eruption over the last 7 or 8 years has basically compensated for the reduction in anthropogenic decline in aerosols in the northern hemisphere. So the net effect globally is very close to zero. Now we can compare these with climate model simulations. There's a bit of a discontinuity here, right? The climate model simulations are saying that the decline in anthropogenic air is an important contributor to the energy imbalance trend, produced about a 0.2 watt per decade trend, whereas we're only seeing like 0.02, right? So there's a order of magnitude difference in these two. And so we're going to look at something called RF-MIP. This is the radiative forcing model in a comparison project, and what they did is they used historical aerosol forcings with fixed sea surface temperatures and a number of different climate models to try to simulate what the trend in aerosol cloud interactions was over the historical period. So on the right, these gray bars show the trend in 60 north to 60 south, shortwave aerosol cloud interactions from the climate models. The black line here shows the multi-model mean. And then the two graphs on the right show the observational estimate of the trend. And you can see they're basically zero, right? So why do the models show a much larger trend in aerosol cloud interaction than the observations? Well, we can get some idea for this if we look into the different hemispheres. One, if we look at just the northern hemisphere, that's on the left here, southern hemisphere is on the right. So observations in the northern hemisphere do show a positive trend in the aerosol cloud interaction. It's still not as large as you see in the models, but it's still a positive trend. But they show an almost equally offsetting negative trend in the southern hemisphere, whereas the models still show a positive trend in the southern hemisphere. So while the observations have this interhemispheric offset, the models do not have that. And we can look into more detail. We can look at just the trends in sulfate concentration. This is the top shows the global trend in sulfate concentration. The orange line is from the observations, and the black line is the multi-model mean of models. And then we can separate that into the northern hemisphere is the middle panel, and the southern hemisphere is the lower panel. So in the northern hemisphere, you see the models have a much larger decline in sulfate concentrations after about 2014. And so the way these model simulations are put together is they use the observed changes in aerosol emissions up to 2014, and then they use a projection of future changes in aerosol concentrations past 2014. They don't actually use observed changes in aerosol emissions from 2014 out to 2023. They're using projections. And it turns out that these projections showed a much larger decline in sulfate emissions than what was actually observed, at least in MERA-2. And you'll see, we see a very similar thing in MODIS. So the models exaggerated the Northern Hemisphere sulfate decline after 2014. They had a much larger decline than what we've actually seen. And in the Southern Hemisphere, the answer is also very similar in that the models used observed aerosol concentrations up to 2014, but then beyond that, again, they're using projections. They have no idea that there's been an increase in forest fires or volcanic eruptions from 2014 to 2023. So there's a complete lack of any natural sulfate aerosol increase after 2014. So they don't get that compensation of increased aerosol loading in the Southern Hemisphere. And they overestimate the anthropogenic decline in aerosol emissions in the Northern Hemisphere. So that's the bottom line of why there's this much larger aerosol cloud interaction in the model simulations. You get the same thing if instead of looking at the MERA-2, if you look at MODIS aerosol index, we can do the same kind of comparison and you get the same thing. There's a lack of increased aerosols in the Southern Hemisphere and an exaggerated decline in aerosols in the Northern Hemisphere. And so that difference produces a much larger aerosol cloud interaction and a much larger net warming effect of aerosol trends in models than in observations, simply because the aerosol loading is wrong. And so with that, it takes me to kind of the take-home points. I think we can make observational estimates. I really like the cloud controlling factor analysis that Casey Walls introduced. I do think that explicitly including aerosol activation is an important tweak to that cloud controlling factor analysis. I do think that you have to include that explicitly. And when you do that, you get a much lower estimate of the effective radiative forcing from aerosols. And then just again, summarize why recent model simulations suggest a large contribution of aerosols to the trend in Earth's energy imbalance. The bottom line is just that the aerosol loading the models are using is not consistent with what actually has happened over the last 10 years. And with that, thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you. So now if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it, or raise your hand if you'd prefer me to call on you. Or if you don't have a microphone, you can just type it in the chat.
I'll ask a really basic one if I could.
Go ahead.
It's about the perfect model experiments and the cross-validation. I'm wondering whether the result depends on how the model simulates clouds.
It probably does. And so, we can only test that within the group of models where we have the required data available. And, I have to go back to the graph and see exactly how many models that was, but it was like around a dozen different models, I think. Yeah.
And if you chose a model that didn't have this activation mechanism that you're proposing, do you think you'd get a similar result?
Well, they all have some activation at some level, but that is the dominant source of intermodal spread. So most of the intermodal spread in at least the ERF ACI true is driven by differences in how models parameterize activation, especially for the smaller distribution of aerosol sizes, apparently. And so are we really sampling the full distribution of activation rates? It's hard for me to answer that. We can only say within this range of models that we have available to test against how it works. So That maybe
Sure.
wasn't a very satisfactory answer, but can it depend on it? I could conceive of that, yeah, but I don't have any evidence that it would be any different with a larger sample of models.
Great. Thank you.
Hello, this is Ross Solowich. Thanks for a really outstanding talk. I have a sort of a two-part question, and they both relate to the very first slide you showed with data on it, which was the Earth's energy imbalance over time. And I'll let you get there.
Okay. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah. So my question is, doing this in my head, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that what you're saying here kind of means we still don't understand this, and particularly in the last few years. But can you comment, kind of close the loop on the implications of, sulfate being flat on this chart, what's driving it? And then further, to hit you with even more of a question, what do you think the maritime emissions of sulfate are doing as well? The big reduction since,
Yeah. Well, for the first part, I think you summarized it perfectly, that we don't understand what's driving it. That would be kind of where I stand right now. I mean, first it could be that our estimates of aerosol susceptibility are wrong. It could be that observational estimates of aerosol loading, aerosol trends over the last 20 years are unreliable or wrong. It could be that model estimates of internal variability are wrong, and this is perfectly consistent with internal variability. So there's I don't honestly have a strong bias towards one or other of these potential explanations. I do think that the ship emissions are probably not a dominant contributor to this trend, just in part because I think the total anthropogenic reductions in the Northern Hemisphere greatly outweighs what the reduction in aerosol emissions from ship tracks has been. So just the fact that, Europe, the US and China have reduced their sulfate emissions, I think that is the dominant driver of anthropogenic aerosol trends, and is much larger than the contribution you get from ships. And I think there have been other recent studies that, have tried to point that out. I'm not saying that ship emissions have zero effect. I'm sure there is some effect, but I think the dominant anthropogenic effect would come from other sources. So I guess that's my thoughts on that.
Thanks. If no one has any more questions, I have a follow-up, but I'll pause.
There are a couple of hands up, Ross.
Okay, go to them.
Yeah, okay, we can come back to you, but I think Dr. Lee is next.
Brian, thank you for really great talk. So my question is regard to somewhat relevant to this, just to even use this diagram showing the imbalance of the energy. I just wonder if we look at this problem from both regional and global, regional and different time period, I wonder if we can get consistent result. What I mean that you mentioned that U.S. China has reduced sulfate emission a lot, and their reduction quite happened different time period. For the U.S. Starting in 2000 and the sulfate reduction, and in China in the last 10 years there were a lot significant dramatic reduction. So if we look at the regional scale on different time period, that would will probably strengthen your argument if that's the case.
I think that's a great point, and it's not something that we have tried, but there are definitely distinct regions, both Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere, even for the wildfire emissions as well. There's sort of distinct time periods and distinct regions that you could look at, in addition to what you're saying in terms of the Northern Hemisphere anthropogenic. I mean, I think it's a great suggestion. We haven't tried to do that, but I agree that I think it's something that's worth looking into.
Great, thank you.
Claudia has her hand up next.
Hi, Brian. I was thinking about your perfect model experiment as well. And one thing that strikes me is that you're using aerosol only simulation where, of course, there is no warming. In fact, there is cooling. And if among the factors in your multilinear regression, you have something that interacts with warming or cooling, that could kind of throw your validation a bit awry. But of course, I have no idea. I'm just raising maybe something to think about.
Yeah,
But thank
Claudia,
you.
it's a good
It
point.
was a really interesting talk.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. It's a good point because there is, and so it almost becomes a feedback from the aerosol forcing that's also included in the in the ERF true that that we get from the climate model output. That is not something that is kind of explicitly attempted to be accounted for in our kind of multilinear regression estimate of it, right? So yeah, you're 100% correct on that. Yeah. So I agree with your point. In fact, we had, and so this is maybe to kind of answer Ross's question a little bit. And since you brought it up, Claudia, I wasn't gonna, so here's one possible explanation. Okay. So this kind of gets at the point that Claudia is making, is that aerosols can also have a non-local effect on clouds. And so this is from a paper I published a long time ago where we tried to isolate these two things. So the top panel shows what I would call ERF ACI true. So it's the change in cloud rate, shortwave cloud radiative effect by a single aerosol only forcing experiment, but it's being done in a coupled model, right? So here the aerosols can change the cloud optical properties locally, but they're also changing the pattern of surface temperature change, which induces circulation changes, which also changes the clouds, right? So we call that the microphysical plus dynamical effect of aerosols on clouds. Now, you can get rid of the dynamical part just by fixing surface temperature. So that way, surface temperatures don't change. The circulation basically remains unchanged. So here, the only thing that's changing is the direct effect locally of aerosols on clouds. So we call that the microphysical. And then we just difference these two and called that difference the dynamical contribution, right? And so you can see that there is this coherent dynamical contribution that when you put aerosols in the northern hemisphere, you're kind of cooling the northern hemisphere, and this is our interpretation of it, that shifts the ITCZ to the southern hemisphere, which kind of does things to clouds, right? So you're changing the large scale circulation. So, and to get at Ross's question, so one possible explanation here is that maybe there is something similar going on with the southern hemisphere aerosol loading. So you can imagine the southern hemisphere aerosol loading as being the opposite of this pattern down here at the bottom. The dynamical response to southern hemisphere aerosol loading would give you more absorbed short radiation in the hemisphere opposite where the aerosol loading is going on and so forth. Anyways, the point of this is that, and this is all completely speculative, but you could imagine doing some model simulation experiments where you try to isolate these microphysical and dynamical contributions and just see, is there a different dynamical contribution going on now from the southern hemisphere aerosol loading? Yeah, so sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but thanks for bringing up the question, Claudia.
We have another question from Lazarus. Go ahead, or Lazaros.
Hi, Brian. How are you? So I had a technical question about the calculation of the effective radiative forcing due to aerosol cloud interactions, the susceptibility term. Do you, if you do it, if you show it, yeah. Okay, yeah, this equation here. Do you like literally use the cloud radiative effect? And my question is, isn't the clear component of that also affected by changes in the aerosol loading? You're not isolating the effect of clouds here, right? If the clear sky flux is also changing.
Yeah, I skipped this. This is the adjusted cloud radiative effect. So I kind of skipped over that point. So we are adjusting for the clear sky contributions using the radiative kernels when we estimate the CRE from low cloud.
Also, it is the cloudy flux then. It's not the CRE in the traditional sense. Okay.
It's the adjusted CRE, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So that is my cue for questions. Ross, I don't know if you wanted to jump in and ask that question that I cut you off from earlier.
Oh, sure. Well, fantastic questions and answers. It's just so great to see everyone together talking about science. And I do have a follow-up, and that is, there are a series of papers, one led by Jim Carton of AOSC, about the unbelievably warm Atlantic starting in 2023. And so, when we're looking at natural variability and forcing and the radiative budget, I think there are going to be PhD dissertations written on that as well. I don't know if Brian wants to comment, but it was crazy warm in both the surface and the mixed layer of the North Atlantic for the past few years.
Yeah, and that was always my hypothesis as to why, last year we were supposed to have this record-breaking, crazy tropical cyclone, North Atlantic hurricane season, right? And so my hypothesis, and I'm still trying to get, students or colleagues to try to look into this and test this, is that it was the unusually warm North Atlantic waters, kind of in the middle latitudes and further north, that suppressed the tropical cyclone activity in the tropical North Atlantic. So I do think it was really an interesting event, and yeah, definitely worth a few PhD dissertations. I agree.
Awesome, thank you.
Do we have any other questions while we still have our speaker here today? Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending this talk, and thank you so much to Professor Soden for giving this great talk, and for the really lively Q&A session. That's always wonderful. So otherwise, we will continue our series next week, and have a wonderful rest of your week, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.